I should have said yes. Everyone else did. But I looked him in the eyes, and I said no. The first time I heard the name Adrian Voss, it wasn't spoken like a name. It was spoken like a warning, low and careful, the way people talk about storms they've survived or fires they barely escaped. And I remember thinking it was ridiculous, because how dangerous could one man really be? How much power could someone have over an entire room full of strangers? But that was before I saw what silence looked like when he walked in. Before I understood how fear could fill a space without making a single sound. And that night started like every other shift I had ever worked. Long hours, sore feet, the smell of expensive wine I could never afford, my black uniform pressed just enough to pass inspection under dim lighting, my hair pulled back tight, because loose strands meant complaints and complaints meant fewer tips, and tips were the only reason I could afford my one-bedroom apartment that barely fit a bed and a folding table. I had been on my feet for almost 10 hours, refilling glasses, memorizing orders, smiling at people who never really saw me. Just another part of the service, invisible unless something went wrong. And everything was fine until the manager stopped mid-sentence and straightened his jacket like someone had just pulled an invisible string, his voice dropping half an octave as he whispered to the staff, "He's here." And that was all it took. No explanation, no full name, just those two words. And suddenly the entire room shifted, conversations softened, laughter faded into something controlled. Even the clinking of silverware seemed quieter, like the air itself had decided to behave. And I didn't turn right away. I told myself I wouldn't, because I didn't want to be like everyone else, reacting to someone I hadn't even seen. But curiosity is a stubborn thing, and eventually I looked, just a glance at first, enough to see the man everyone else had already adjusted their lives around. He wasn't what I expected, not loud, not surrounded by chaos, just composed, tall, dressed in a dark suit that fit like it was made for him and no one else. His presence didn't demand attention. It removed the option to ignore him. People moved without being asked. Space opened where there hadn't been any before, and he walked through it like it belonged to him, like everything belonged to him. And I remember thinking, okay, now I see it. Now I understand why they whisper, but understanding something doesn't mean accepting it. And that's where I made my mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake at all. Maybe it was the only honest thing I had done in a long time. Because when my manager pushed me toward his table with a tray of wine glasses balanced carefully in my hands, I didn't hesitate. I didn't overthink it. I just walked, one step at a time, steady, controlled, like I had done 1,000 times before, except this time the entire room felt like it was watching, like I had stepped onto a stage without realizing it. And when I reached his table, when I felt the weight of his presence before I even fully looked at him, my hand trembled just enough. Just a fraction of an inch. And that was all it took, one small slip, one drop of dark red spilling over the edge of the glass and landing against his sleeve. And time didn't stop. It stretched, long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat, long enough to feel every eye in the room shift toward us, waiting, expecting, because this was the moment where I was supposed to apologize, to lower my gaze, to say yes to whatever came next, because that's what everyone did. That's what survival looked like in a room like this. But when his voice cut through the silence, low and controlled, just 2 words, "Look at me," something inside me refused, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, immovable refusal that had been building long before this night, long before him. And I lifted my chin just enough to meet his eyes, steady, unflinching, and I said the one word no one else ever had. No. The word hung between us like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. Not loud, not defiant in the way people expect rebellion to sound. Just steady, just certain, and that was what made it different, because I was not challenging him. I was simply not yielding. And for a moment nothing happened. No sharp reaction, no raised voices, just silence stretching longer than it should have. The kind of silence that makes people shift uncomfortably in their seats. And I could feel it. The weight of every person in that room watching, waiting for him to correct me, to restore whatever invisible order I had just disrupted. But he did not move. Not right away. His eyes stayed on mine, dark and unreadable, like he was trying to figure out if I was serious or just too naive to understand what I had done. And maybe I should have looked away then. Maybe that was the smart thing to do, but I had already crossed the line. and stepping back would have meant pretending I had not meant it. And I did. I meant every letter of that word. So I held his gaze even as my pulse climbed higher, even as my fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray just to keep them from shaking again. And then something shifted, not in the room, in him, subtle but unmistakable, like a decision being made behind those eyes. And instead of anger, instead of the reaction everyone expected, he leaned back, slightly in his chair, just enough to break the tension without releasing it completely. And his voice when he spoke again was quieter, almost thoughtful. No. He repeated, like he was testing the sound of it, like it was unfamiliar. And maybe it was. Maybe no one had ever given him that answer before. Not like this. Not without fear wrapped around it. And I realized then that this was not over, not even close. Because the way he looked at me now was different, less like I had made a mistake, and more like I had become a question he intended to solve. And that was somehow more unsettling. Because questions do not get ignored, they get pursued. And the manager was standing just a few feet away, frozen, his expression caught somewhere between panic and disbelief, clearly unsure whether to intervene or disappear, and the rest of the staff had found very important reasons to be anywhere else, leaving me standing there alone at a table that suddenly felt like the center of the world. And I could feel the expectation pressing in again, the silent pressure for me to fix this, to say something, to apologize, to undo what I had done. But I did not speak, because I had learned a long time ago that once you give up your ground, even once, it becomes easier for people to take the rest. And I was tired of that, tired of shrinking, tired of adjusting myself to fit someone else's idea of control. And whatever this man was used to, whatever power he carried into every room, it did not get to decide who I was, not tonight, not anymore. And for a second I thought he might smile, not kindly, not warmly, but like someone recognizing a pattern they had not seen before. But the expression never fully formed. It faded before it could become anything clear, replaced instead by something sharper, more focused, and he lifted his hand slightly, not toward me, just enough for the men standing nearby to pause, to wait, to not move without instruction. And that was when I understood the real difference. Not the money, not the suit, not even the silence. It was control. The kind that did not need to prove itself because it was already absolute. And yet somehow, in this one small moment, it had not worked on me. And that was what held his attention, not the spill, not the mistake, but the refusal. And when he spoke again, it was not a command this time. It was a question, simple, direct, and somehow heavier than anything he could have ordered. Why not? And I could have given him a safe answer, something polite, something that would let this end without pushing it further. But that would have been another version of yes, just disguised differently. So I took a breath, steady, controlled, and I told him the truth. Because you do not get to decide for me. And the words felt solid the moment they left my mouth, like they belonged there, like they had been waiting for the right moment to exist. And this was it. This was the point where everything could still go in any direction. But one thing was already certain. I was no longer invisible. And whatever happened next, he had noticed me. For a moment I thought that would be it, that he would nod once, dismiss me, and let the night continue as if nothing had happened. But that was not how men like him worked. I could feel it in the way his attention did not leave me, not even when someone at the table tried to speak to him, their voice low and cautious, testing whether it was safe to interrupt. And he did not respond to them, not immediately, because I had shifted something small but enough to change the rhythm of the room. And then he did something I did not expect. He stood up, slow, deliberate, not rushed, not dramatic, just controlled. And when he moved, the air seemed to move with him. People adjusted without thinking. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Conversations paused again. And suddenly I was aware of how close he was, closer than before. Close enough that I could see the faint lines at the edge of his eyes, the kind that come from watching more than smiling. And I told myself not to step back, not to give him that space. Because space was power, and I had already given up enough of that in my life. So I stayed where I was, even as every instinct told me this was not a situation you held your ground in. And he stopped just short of me. Not touching, not reaching, just there. And it was strange, because there was no anger in his expression, none of the sharpness I had expected, just focus, like I was something new he had not planned for. And his voice when he spoke again was softer than before, but somehow more intense. "You should be careful," he said, not as a threat, not exactly. More like a statement of fact, and I understood what he meant, even if he did not say it outright. That people who said no to men like him did not usually get to walk away unchanged. But I had heard versions of that before, from different voices, in different places, always wrapped in concern that was really control, and I was done mistaking one for the other. So I met his gaze again, steady, even as my heart refused to slow down, and I answered, "I am." And for the first time, something in his expression shifted in a way I could recognize, not confusion, not irritation, something closer to interest, real interest, the kind that lingers. And it made something tighten in my chest, because a tension like that did not fade easily. It followed, it stayed, and I had the sudden, unmistakable sense that this moment was not ending. It was beginning. And then he glanced down briefly at the dark stain on his sleeve, the wine that had started all of this. And instead of reacting the way anyone else would have, he brushed it off with a simple, almost absent motion, like it did not matter at all, like the only thing that mattered now was me. And that realization sent a different kind of tension through me, quieter but deeper, because mistakes can be forgiven, accidents can be ignored, but being noticed is something else. Entirely. And then he stepped back, just one step, enough to break the immediate intensity, but not enough to release it. And he turned slightly toward my manager, who had been standing frozen this entire time, waiting for instructions he had not been given, and Adrian's voice returned to that calm, controlled tone. "She stays," he said, simple, final, and I felt the words more than I heard them, because they were not directed at me, but they affected me all the same, and my manager nodded. Immediately, too quickly, relief and fear mixing in his expression as he agreed without hesitation. And just like that, a decision had been made about me without me. And that was the irony of it. I had just said no. I had just claimed my ground. And yet here I was, still caught inside his world, still part of something I had not chosen. And I realized then that saying no was only the first step. It did not end anything. It changed the game, and I was now playing whether I wanted to or not. And as he turned back toward his table, as the room slowly began to breathe again, conversations restarting, movement returning, I stood there for a second longer than I should have, trying to steady myself, trying to understand what had just happened, and then I felt it. That same awareness from before, subtle but undeniable, his attention still on me even as he walked away, and I knew, without needing to look, that this was not over, not for him, and not for me. The rest of the night did not return to normal, not for me. Even though the room pretended it had, conversations picked back up, glasses clinked, soft laughter filled the space again like nothing had happened. But I could feel the difference, subtle and constant, like a shift in temperature that no one acknowledged out loud. And every step I took after that felt measured, deliberate, because I knew I was no longer invisible. I knew that somewhere in that room, even when he was not looking directly at me, I was still part of his awareness, and that kind of attention does not fade. It waits, it observes, and I tried to focus on my work, on the routine I knew so well, refilling water, clearing plates, keeping my movements smooth and professional. But it was harder now, because every time I passed his table, I could feel it again, that quiet intensity, not invasive, not aggressive, just present, like he was studying something he had not yet decided how to handle, and it made my thoughts restless, because I did not understand what he wanted, not really, and uncertainty is its own kind of pressure. And about 20 minutes later, my manager appeared beside me. Too quickly, too carefully, his voice low, almost rehearsed. He would like to see you, and I paused, just for a second, because those words carried weight, not because of how they were said, but because of who they came from. And I could feel that familiar expectation again. The one that said I should go without question, that this was not a request in the way most people understand requests, but something inside me pushed back against that idea immediately, firm and quiet, and I looked at my manager, really looked at him, at the nervous way he held himself, at the way he avoided meeting my eyes, and I realized that if I went now without choosing to, then everything I had said earlier would mean nothing. It would just be another version of yes dressed up as compliance. And I could not do that, not again. So I asked, calm, steady, do I have to? And the question seemed to catch him off guard, because he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, long enough for the truth to exist in that pause. Before he answered carefully, "It would be better if you did." And there it was, not an order, not exactly, but close enough to feel like one, and I let out a slow breath, grounding myself, because this was the moment that mattered more than the first one, the moment where most people would bend, not out of fear, but out of practicality, out of the quiet understanding that some things are easier if you just go along with them. And maybe they were right. Maybe this would be easier if I just walked over, said whatever he wanted to hear, and let the night end without complication. But easy had never protected me before. Easy had never given me control, and I was done choosing it just to make other people comfortable. So I straightened my posture slightly, adjusted the tray in my hands, and said, "Then he can wait." And I could feel the impact of that decision immediately, not loud, not visible, but real, because my manager blinked, clearly unsure how to respond, clearly not used to hearing that kind of answer, and for a second I thought he might argue, might push harder, but he did not. He just nodded once, stiffly, and stepped back, like he needed distance from whatever I had just done, and I returned to my work, not rushing, not hiding, just continuing as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. And a few minutes later, when I finally allowed myself to glance in his direction again, Adrian was no longer sitting back in quiet observation. He was watching me directly now, not subtle, not distant, just there, his gaze steady and unmistakable. And this time, when our eyes met across the room, there was something different in his expression, something that looked almost like approval, or maybe recognition, and that unsettled me more than anything else had, because I had expected resistance, maybe even consequences, but not this, not interest that deepened instead of fading. And as I held his gaze for just a second before looking away, I understood something I had not before. Saying no had not ended his attention, it had earned it, and that was a far more complicated problem. The rest of the shift stretched longer than it should have, not because of the hours but because of the awareness that refused to leave me. It sat just beneath my skin, quiet but constant, like a second heartbeat that did not belong to me. And no matter how many tables I served, or how many times I told myself to focus, I could feel it, that invisible thread pulling my attention back to him again. And I hated it, not because it scared me, but because it mattered, because part of me had already started to anticipate it. And that was something I did not trust, not in myself, not in this situation. And I kept moving, steady, controlled, refusing to let my pace change, refusing to let anyone see that anything was different, because the moment you look affected, people assume you are. And I was not going to give them that, not tonight. And yet when the final hour came, when the crowd began to thin and the music softened into something slower, more distant, I felt the shift again, subtle but unmistakable, like the night itself was narrowing down to something unfinished. And I knew before I even turned that he was no longer at his table. The space he had occupied now empty, glasses cleared, chairs pushed back, as if he had never been there at all. But I knew better, because presence like his does not disappear, it relocates. And sure enough, when I stepped into the service corridor to grab a fresh stack of linens, I saw him, standing at the far end, alone, not surrounded by people, not shielded by distance, just there, waiting. And for a second I stopped without meaning to, my body reacting before my mind could catch up, because this was different. This was not a crowded room with rules and expectations. This was quiet, contained, intentional, and I could feel the space between us like something solid, something I had to choose whether to cross or not. And he did not move toward me, did not close that distance himself. He just watched, like he was giving me the option, and that was new. That was something I had not expected. And it unsettled me more than any command would have, because choice comes with responsibility, and I could not pretend this was happening to me if I decided to walk forward. And for a moment I considered turning around, taking a different route, pretending I had not seen him at all, but that would have been avoidance, not control, and I had promised myself I would not hide, not anymore. So I adjusted my grip on the linens, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward him, each step measured, each breath steady, until I was close enough to see the details. Again, the precision in the way he held himself, the calm that did not need to prove anything. And when I stopped a few feet away, he spoke first, his voice low but clear in the quiet hallway. You kept me waiting. And there was no accusation in it, no edge, just observation, like he was noting a fact rather than challenging it. And I met his gaze without hesitation, because this was no longer about reacting. It was about choosing, and I said, I was working. Simple, direct, nothing more. And for a second, something almost like amusement flickered in his expression, subtle enough that I might have imagined it, but real enough to change the atmosphere between us. And he nodded once, slow, acknowledging the answer without dismissing it. And then he took a step closer, not invading, just reducing the distance slightly, enough to make the space feel more deliberate, more focused, and his eyes stayed on mine as he spoke again. Most people would have come when asked, and there it was. Again, that quiet expectation wrapped in calm words, and I could feel the weight of it, the implication beneath it, but I did not step back, did not soften, because I understood something now that I had not before. This was not about obedience. This was about definition, about who I was going to be in this moment. And I answered without lowering my voice. I am not most people. And the words settled between us, firm and unshaken. And this time, he did smile, not wide, not warm, but real, like he had just confirmed something he suspected, and he tilted his head slightly, studying me with that same focused attention that had followed me all night. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, not control, not expectation, something closer to curiosity. No, he said quietly, almost to himself, you are not. And for the first time since this night began, I realized something that shifted everything again. I was not just resisting him anymore. I was changing the way he saw the world, even if only by an inch, and that was far more powerful than I had intended. For a moment neither of us spoke, and the silence in that narrow hallway felt different from the one out in the dining room. It was not filled with people, pretending not to notice. It was just us, real and unfiltered, and I realized how rare that was, how rare it was to stand in front of someone like him without an audience, without the invisible pressure of everyone else's expectations shaping the moment. And it made everything sharper, clearer, like the edges of this conversation mattered more than anything that had happened before, and I could feel it in the way he watched me. Not impatient, not demanding, just present, like he was waiting to see what I would do next rather than deciding it for me. And that changed something in me, because I was used to reacting, to adjusting, to reading people quickly so I could stay one step ahead of whatever they wanted. But this was different. This was someone who did not need to rush, someone who could afford to wait. And that meant every choice I made here would matter more, not less. And I tightened my grip on the linen slightly, grounding myself in something physical, something familiar. Because the rest of this felt like stepping into unknown territory. And he broke the silence first, his voice low but steady. Do you always do that? He asked, and I knew what he meant. Not just tonight, not just with him, but the way I held my ground, the way I refused to bend even when it would have been easier. And for a second I considered giving him a simple answer, something light, something that would keep this from going any deeper than it needed to. But I had already come too far for that, already said too much to pretend now. So I answered honestly, only when it matters. And his eyes sharpened slightly at that, not in a threatening way, but in recognition, like he understood the weight behind those words, like he knew that I was not saying them to impress him or challenge him. I was saying them because they were true, and that seemed to interest him more than anything else had so far. And he took another step, slow, measured, not closing the distance completely, just enough to shift the balance again. And I noticed something then, something I had not expected. There was restraint in the way he moved, not hesitation, not uncertainty, just control, the kind that chooses not to cross a line rather than being unable to. And that told me more about him than anything anyone had whispered earlier that night. Because power that needs to prove itself is loud, but power that knows itself does not have to be. And that realization settled somewhere deep, changing the way I saw him. Not softer, not safer, just clearer. And he tilted his head slightly, studying me in that same focused way. And this matters, he said, not quite a question, more like he was confirming it out loud. And I nodded once. Because there was no point pretending otherwise, not now, not after everything that had already happened. And the air between us shifted again, quieter this time, less tense, but not relaxed, more like something had been acknowledged, something unspoken but understood. And for a second I wondered what he saw when he looked at me, because I knew what everyone else saw, a waitress, someone replaceable, someone easy to overlook. But he did not look at me that way, not anymore, and that made something in my chest tighten, not fear, something more complicated, something I did not have a name for yet. And then he did something I did not expect at all. He stepped back, not away from me entirely, just enough to create space again, and he nodded once, like he had reached some kind of conclusion, and his voice when he spoke carried a finality that had been missing before. "Go back to work," he said, calm, controlled, not dismissive, just direct, and I blinked, just for a second, because that was not what I had prepared for, not what I had expected this moment to end with, and yet it felt right, not because he had told me to go, but because he had not tried to keep me, and that was the difference. That was the line that had not been crossed, and I realized then that whatever this was, whatever had started between us tonight, it was not about control in the way I had known it before. It was something else, something that moved differently. And as I turned to leave, as I walked back down that hallway toward the noise and the routine and the safety of everything familiar, I could still feel it, that awareness, that connection that had formed without permission and without warning, and I knew, without needing to look back, that this was not the end of it, because some moments do not fade when they are over. They follow you. They wait, and this one had just begun. By the time I stepped back into the dining room, everything looked the same. The soft lighting, the low conversations, the polished surfaces reflecting a version of calm that did not match what I felt inside. But something had shifted, not around me, within me, like a line had been drawn that I could not step back across even if I wanted to, and I moved through the rest of my shift with that awareness sitting just beneath every action, every word, every glance, because now I knew what it felt like to stand my ground and not be pushed, not be corrected, not be dismissed, and that feeling did not fade easily. It stayed. It reshaped the way I carried myself, the way I responded, even in small moments, and I noticed it in the way I spoke to customers, still polite, still professional, but no longer shrinking, no longer adjusting myself to fit into whatever space they expected me to occupy. And it was subtle, so subtle no one else would have pointed it out, but I felt it, and that was enough. And when my shift finally ended, when the last table had been cleared and the lights dimmed just enough to signal closing, I stepped outside into the cool night air, the city quieter than it had been hours before, the streetlights casting long reflections across the wet pavement from an earlier rain. And for the first time that night, I let myself exhale fully, letting the tension leave my shoulders in a slow, controlled release. Because I had made it through, nothing had happened the way everyone would have expected, nothing had gone wrong. And yet nothing felt simple anymore, because I could still feel it, that connection, that awareness that had formed without permission and without warning, and I told myself it would fade, that whatever this was, it belonged to that building, to that night, and once I walked away, it would stay there, just another strange moment that I would eventually forget. And I started down the sidewalk, my steps steady, familiar, the rhythm of my life returning with each block I passed, until I heard it, not loud, not sudden, just the soft sound of a car door closing somewhere behind me, and I did not turn right away, because something in me already knew, not with certainty, but with instinct, and instinct is rarely wrong, and I kept walking for 3 more steps before I stopped, just long enough to take a breath, to steady myself, and then I turned, slow, deliberate, not reacting, choosing, and there he was, across the street, leaning lightly against a dark car that looked as precise and controlled as everything else about him, not approaching, not calling out, just there, like he had been there the entire time, like this was not a coincidence but a continuation, and for a second we just looked at each other, the distance between us filled with the quiet hum of the city, distant traffic, the faint sound of voices somewhere down the block, but none of it mattered, because the focus had narrowed again, just like it had inside, just like it had in that hallway, and I felt it, that same tension, not fear, not pressure, something else entirely, something that felt like being seen in a way that was both unsettling and impossible to ignore, and I realized then that walking away had not ended anything. It had only changed the setting, and he pushed himself off the car, straightening slightly, his movements unhurried, controlled, and even from this distance I could feel the intent behind them, not to chase, not to corner, just to close the space between us enough to continue what had already started. And he stepped forward once, then stopped, leaving the rest of the distance for me. And that choice, that deliberate pause, said more than any words could have, because it meant this was still mine to decide, still mine to control, and I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, weighing something I could not fully explain, because part of me wanted to leave, to keep walking, to return to the version of my life that had existed before tonight. Simple, predictable, safe. But another part of me knew that version had already changed, already shifted in ways I could not undo. And avoiding this would not take me back. It would just leave something unfinished, something unresolved, and I had never been good at ignoring things that mattered. And this, whether I liked it or not, mattered. So I stepped off the curb, crossing the street slowly, each step measured, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, until I was standing in front of him again, the distance between us now close enough to feel the quiet intensity of his presence. And for a second neither of us spoke, because sometimes silence carries more truth than words. And when he finally did speak, his voice was calm, almost quiet against the backdrop of the city. "You could have left," he said, and I met his gaze without hesitation, because that was no longer something I questioned. "I know," I answered, and something in his expression shifted again, that same subtle recognition, like he was watching a pattern unfold that he had not expected but was beginning to understand. And in that moment, standing there under the dim glow of streetlights, I realized something that settled deep and steady inside me. I was not just holding my ground anymore. I was choosing where to stand, and that was something no one had ever given me before, not even him. The space between us felt smaller now, not because of distance but because something had already been decided without either of us saying it out loud. And I could feel it in the way he looked at me, not assessing anymore, not measuring, just certain in a way that made my pulse shift slightly, slower but heavier, like my body was trying to keep up with something my mind had not fully processed yet. And for a moment neither of us spoke, because there was nothing simple left to say, not after everything that had already happened, and the city moved around us in quiet indifference, cars passing, distant footsteps, the hum of a life that did not pause for moments like this. But inside that small space between us, everything felt suspended, focused, intentional, and he broke the silence first, not with a command, not even with a question, just a statement that felt like it carried more weight than it should have. "You are not afraid of me." And I considered that for a second, not rushing to answer, because it was not as simple as yes or no, not in the way he meant it. And I realized that fear was not the right word for what I felt. Not anymore. Maybe it had been earlier, when I did not understand him, when everything about him was just a warning wrapped in silence. But now it was something else, something more complicated, and I shook my head slightly. "Honest, steady, no," I said, and his gaze did not waver, did not change, but something deeper shifted behind it, like that answer had confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. And he nodded once, slow, thoughtful, and then he stepped a little closer, just enough that I could feel the presence of him more clearly, not overwhelming, not invasive, just undeniable, and his voice lowered slightly, not in secrecy, just in focus. "You should be," he said, and there was no threat in it, no sharp edge, just truth the way he understood it. And I held his gaze, not challenging, not defensive, just present, because I understood what he was saying, not about himself, but about the world he lived in, the rules he followed, the kind of life where caution was not optional. And for a second, I saw it. Not the rumors, not the whispers, but the reality beneath them, the weight of something that did not allow softness easily. And instead of stepping back, instead of retreating into something safer, I stayed where I was, and I answered him the only way I could. "Maybe I should be," I said quietly, "but I am not." And the words felt steady, grounded, not reckless, just true. And that seemed to settle something between us, not ending the tension, but reshaping it, making it quieter, more defined. And he studied me for a second longer before exhaling slightly, the smallest shift, almost imperceptible, but enough to change the atmosphere again. And then he did something unexpected, something that did not fit into any of the expectations I had built in my mind about him. He reached into his jacket, slow, deliberate, and pulled out a small card. Simple, clean, nothing excessive about it. And he held it out toward me, not pushing it into my hand, just offering it. And I looked at it for a second before taking it, because refusing now would not mean the same thing it had earlier. This was not about control. This was about choice. And the card was heavier than it looked. Thick paper, precise edges. His name printed in clean lettering with a number beneath it. Nothing else. No title. No explanation. Just identity reduced to something minimal and intentional. And I glanced up at him, questioning without speaking, and he answered anyway, because he seemed to understand silence just as well as words. In case you ever decide something matters again, he said, and there was something in the way he said it. Not expectation, not assumption, just possibility. And that was what made it different, what made it stay. And I looked at the card. Again, feeling its weight in my hand. Not as an obligation, not as a demand, just an option, something I could choose or ignore. And when I met his eyes again, I realized something that settled deep and clear inside me. This was not about him trying to control me anymore. It was about him leaving the door open and waiting to see if I would walk through it. And for the first time since this night began, I understood that whatever came next would not be decided by him alone, and that changed everything. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, the card resting lightly between my fingers, its weight far greater than the thin piece of paper should have allowed. And I could feel it, not just what it was, but what it represented, not power, not control, but choice, something I had fought so hard to keep, something I had refused to give away even when it would have been easier. And now it was sitting in my hand again, offered back to me in a different form, and I realized how rare that was. How rare it was for someone like him to leave space instead of taking it. And when I looked up, he was still watching me, not waiting for an answer, not expecting anything immediate, just present in a way that felt deliberate, like he understood that whatever came next would not happen here, not in this moment. And that made something in my chest settle, not relax, but steady, and I nodded once. Not as agreement, not as acceptance, just acknowledgement, because that was all this moment required. And he seemed to understand that, because he stepped back slightly, creating distance again, returning the space between us to something neutral, something open, and for the first time since I had seen him that night, there was nothing pulling me forward or holding me in place. No invisible pressure, no expectation, just the quiet reality that I could leave, and so I did, turning without hesitation, slipping the card into the pocket of my coat as I stepped away, my pace steady, controlled, not rushed, because leaving was no longer about escape, it was about decision, and with each step down the sidewalk, the distance between us grew, the tension fading into something quieter, something that lingered without demanding attention, and I told myself that this was where it ended, that this was just a moment, a strange, intense, unexpected moment that would eventually become nothing more than a memory, something I would think about occasionally, and then forget, the way people forget things that almost mattered but never quite became real. And yet even as I thought that, I knew it was not entirely true, because some moments do not fade. They change you in ways that are too subtle to notice right away, and I could feel it already, in the way my steps felt more certain, in the way my thoughts moved differently, like something inside me had shifted into place, something that had been missing before, and by the time I reached my apartment building, the city had settled into its late-night quiet, the kind that feels calm but never completely still, and I climbed the stairs slowly, not out of exhaustion, but because I was still thinking, still replaying everything that had happened, every word, every look, every choice. And when I finally stepped inside, closing the door behind me, the silence felt different than it had before, not empty, not lonely, just still, like the world had paused long enough for me to catch up to myself. And I leaned back against the door for a second, letting out a breath I had not realized I was holding, my fingers brushing against the edge of the card in my pocket without fully taking it out, because I did not need to look at it again, not yet. I already knew what it meant, and I knew that whatever I decided to do with it would not be about him. Not really. It would be about me, about whether I was willing to step into something unknown again, something that did not come with guarantees or safety or clear outcomes. And that thought should have unsettled me, should have made me cautious, but instead it felt steady, like standing at the edge of something and realizing you are not afraid of the fall, just aware of the choice. And I pushed myself away from the door, moving through my apartment with familiar motions, setting down my bag, turning on the small lamp by the window, the soft light filling the room in a way that felt grounding, real. And for a moment, everything seemed simple again, normal, like the night had been contained to a single place, a single time. But as I stood there, looking out at the quiet street below, I understood something that settled deep and undeniable inside me. Nothing about this was over, not really, because it had never been about the place or the moment. It had been about the decision, and decisions do not disappear when the night ends. They wait, they follow you, and somewhere across the city, I knew he understood that too, and for the first time, that did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something to consider.